Well, an awful lot going on in First Peter chapter 3 and again starts, and we've seen passages like this throughout our journey through the epistles. We've seen it in Paul's writings, and now we're seeing it in Peter's writings, and this trying to solve the tension between men and women. And it's just I think one of the first observations you might make is that isn't it terrible that there's always been tension between husbands and wives, that this question of how should husbands and wives interact has always been one of the things that the church has wrestled with. And I think especially in the writings of Peter, we can either look at this in our context and say, hey, Peter wrote this to American couples in the 21st century, and we could really make some mistakes as we read this. Or we could read this in context. We could read this in the context of a suffering, struggling church where these people have just come to Christ, and they're trying to figure out what to do in light of their recent conversion to Christ and the intense persecution that comes with their decision to begin following Christ, that kind of a life. And I think if we look at that as the backdrop, we would say, look, what Peter is addressing in this chapter really is some things that naturally happen when people are suffering. People divide, especially families, when there's a lot of tension. It can cause a lot of division between a husband and wife. And also, people get afraid and people lash out. And instead of faith, people respond in fear. This is something that happens when there's suffering coming from the outside. And Peter wants to give some clear direction for a suffering church. So there's a little bit in this passage about husbands and wives, and I want to talk about it again, just devotionally. But then look at the thrust of this chapter is really about suffering. And I think we have to keep suffering as the backdrop. Hey, suffering wives. Hey, suffering husbands. Hey, suffering church. Here's how to frame the world so it makes sense to you. Here's how to act. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. I think your own is the key phrase in there. Wives, likewise, be subject to your own husbands, not other people's husbands, but rather have a heart that's focused towards your husband, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. One of the big question was, and I've seen this over and over, a wife comes to Christ and her husband does not. And in the early church, man, that causes tension even today. But in the early church, now the wife is being ostracized in the market, and she is suffering under the persecution that the culture is causing. And her husband is going, why on earth are you doing this? Like, who is this Jesus guy anyway? And a wife might think, oh, you know what? My husband hasn't come to Christ. It's been a few years. It's made things difficult. Maybe I should leave him. Maybe God would want me to not live with this man who doesn't honor God. And so Peter's encouragement, and you can tell how hard this encouragement would be to receive, is hey, it could be that it's your contact that brings this guy around, that it's out of your respectful and pure conduct. And then he says, do not let your adorning be external, but braiding of hair. So the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry and the wearing of clothes, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. This is how the holy women before. So you're being like Sarah when you do that. Then look at verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as a weaker vessel. Nobody wants to be called weak. That does not hold up real well in our day and age. And yet, Peter is speaking practically. He's not speaking to value. He doesn't say, you're less valuable wife. No, he says, hey, be sure you remember you're bigger and stronger. And this is a practical, important thing. So, because the question, and we'll get to this in just a second, but the question is, how do you use your strength? How do you use all that testosterone, men? He says, so be sure to show honor to your wife as a weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Man, isn't that amazing? Men, treat your wife wrong and God won't listen to your prayers. I'm glad Peter said that, not me, but that is powerful. And so look at the encouragement to women and the encouragement to men. I think this makes a lot of sense to say, women, the thing that you have to manipulate the world is your beauty. It is the external. It is that God has made women more beautiful than men. Men, the thing that you have to be a blessing to the world is your strength. And Peter says, look, here's when it goes bad, is when men are using their strength in inappropriate ways with women, and when women are using their beauty in inappropriate ways with men. And, that is difficult to teach in today's day and age, but I would say that isn't that exactly when relationships between men and women go bad, is when men use their strength to oppress a girl instead of to serve her, to make her do things she doesn't want to do or aren't right to do, instead of using his strength as a means to bless and protect and serve and love. And isn't it the world's version of, feminine power can very easily get to just using external beauty in order to manipulate men around. And Peter would say, instead of that, women, save that, beauty for your husband. And in the community, let your beauty be that inner beauty that comes with kindness and love. Men, don't use your strength to oppress. Don't use your strength to make somebody submit to you. Rather, use your strength to help people, to serve people, to love people. Again, this is to a suffering church and suffering marriages, and somewhere there's men that have wives who haven't converted and women who have husbands who haven't converted, and Peter wants to tell both of them, hey, use the natural gifts that God's given you instead of to manipulate and to control. Use them to serve and to bless both men and women. And then he takes this idea of suffering on, and he says, finally, all of you have unity of mind and sympathy. Man, what great advice. Just have unity of mind. Doesn't mean everybody thinks the same. It means everybody thinks about each other. And sympathy, brotherly love, and a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil, or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For this is what you call, that you may obtain a blessing. Man, this has been all over the New Testament as we've walked through it, is simply think about other people, not yourself. This is the core Christian value, is to stop thinking about yourself so much, think about other people instead. Have brotherly love and tenderness towards your fellow man, especially in the church. And then as they suffer, as these people are suffering from probably Nero's persecution, look at verse 13. Now, who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? Man, Peter, who would be martyred, looks to the suffering church and says, man, if what you want is to do good, nothing can stop you. What are you afraid of if what you want is to honor Christ? You'll honor Christ in life and you'll honor Christ in death. Man, that is a tough, mature Christian perspective. Look at verse 15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Man, even as you live as lights in this dark world, always do this with respect, with kindness, with love. How do you handle suffering? You handle suffering by loving the world and understanding that suffering does not get in the way of your mission for Christ. Look at verse 16. Having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. The most natural thing to do when we're suffering is to divide, is to lash out, is to act in violence or defend ourselves. And Peter is making a case for a very different way to live. Have peaceful marriages. Be ready to defend why you believe what you believe, but do it with love and kindness. Have unity in your minds. Have tenderness and sympathy for other people. And then be sure that you have a good and clear conscience. Live in such a way that you are ready to meet Christ right now. That you are ready, that if suffering would even end in your death, that you have a clear conscience. Love, selflessness. This is what Peter is calling for, which is why in the beginning of the passage, I think if you use passages like the first part of 1 Peter chapter 3 as a weapon to keep the opposite sex beneath you, man, you miss the point of this absolutely entirely. No, rather, it's use your gifts to care for other people, to love other people, submit to each other in love, and let this be the way you handle struggles in your world. Man, we're not suffering under the persecution of Nero, but I bet there's suffering in your life. And the question is, are we going to respond to suffering in a human way, where we lash out, where we divide, where we get mad, where we argue? Or are we going to handle suffering like Christ, in unity and love, caring for each other, and with peace? Hey, be loved.